Before we begin, I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am a white settler speaking to you from Toronto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat peoples and the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee confederacies, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. We acknowledge all who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on this territory. In light of recent events, many settlers are taking the time to listen, to learn, and to reflect on the meaning of reconciliation and what it demands of us. Let it compel all of us to move beyond words of acknowledgement and into actions that will right wrongs, and to commit to learning the history of the genocide, displacement, and theft of land from Indigenous nations, and to continuously decolonize frameworks and roles that are imposed upon Indigenous peoples. We're reminded that colonization is not just a part of long ago history, but continues to impact and shape communities. And as such, we have a choice in how we participate in the treaties of these lands. Today's session is the 6th installment in the Arts Response Tracking Survey, a partnership between business and arts, the National Arts Centre, and Nanos Research, which provides the arts sector with a deeper understanding of Canadians' attitudes on returning to indoor and outdoor arts and cultural events across Canada. This edition of the survey was first in the field in late August. I'd like to thank founding partner National Arts Centre for their continued support and commitment to the Arts Response Tracking Survey. I'd also like to thank supporters David Bennett and NAC Foundation donors Irfan Raji and Christine Armstrong. This webinar is also included in the monthly Business and Arts Speaker Series, so I'd also like to thank the series presenting partner, Power Corporation, and supporting partner, Manulife. A couple of small housekeeping items for today's session. The English and French translation of the full Nano report is now available on our website. We're also happy to have ASL interpreters Melanie Ridgway and Christopher Deloge from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service with us here today. Only the presenters and moderators will have our microphones on, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box and vote for the ones that you think are most relevant. The session is scheduled for 1 hour and 15 minutes to give us ample time to address those questions. All right, so we are starting today's session with a presentation of the research findings by Nick Nanos. Nick is Chief Data Scientist and founder of Nanos Research, one of Canada's most distinguished research companies. You may have seen a lot of them recently during the federal election as the official pollster for CTV News, the Globe and Mail, and Bloomberg News in Canada. Nick is also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a research professor at the State University of New York, and is the past chair of Carleton University's Board of Governors. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nick.
Thanks, Aubrey. And hello, everyone. We're very pleased to share the latest results of the Arts Response Tracking Study that we do for business and the arts and the National Arts Centre. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. So the screen should be shared. As you can see, actually, as you know, for those of you that have been following the study over the last number of waves, there are 2 components. One component relates to tracking the views and behaviors of individuals who self-identify themselves as culture goers, and then we usually have a special topic. And not to scoop myself, but I guess I have scooped myself, but you see one of the things that we decided to drill down on this particular wave of research was perceptions related to the survival of arts and cultural organizations and also donations. I'm going to get into that a little in a little more detail in a few minutes, but you know, the long and the short is that this particular study that we're reporting on is based on research of about 708 individuals. It was conducted, as Aubrey mentioned, at the end of the summer. It's accurate 3.7 percentage points, 19 times out of 20. And let's start digging into the numbers because it's actually quite interesting what's been going on. On the positive side of the ledger, when we ask culture goers, and as you recall, when we say culture goers, we're talking about Canadians who reported that they participated in person in an arts and cultural activity in the 12 months before the pandemic. And so those are the individuals that we're talking about. The interesting thing is that when we look at what I'll say returning to in-person events, you can see that the numbers are trending positively over the last number of months, and that by the end of August, you can see for indoor events, about 1 out of every 5 culture goers have reported already attending indoor events. It's a significant increase from where we were back in May and February, almost tripling the results. Also of note, more than 3 out of every or three almost actually more than 1 out of every 3 individuals have returned to outdoor events. And you can see that's up a full 26 percentage points. And also, when we look at individuals who report having returned to museums, that's up to 32% and about 18 points. So on the positive side, when we look at the trending over time, what we can see is that throughout this pandemic, as we get through a number of waves, as there's more certainty now than there has been in the past, with the rollout of vaccinations in many provinces and regions across the country, that culture goers are increasingly reporting to participating directly and returning to in-person events, whether they be museums, outdoor, or indoor events. And the thing is that what we have to remember, and we talked about this as vaccinations being one of the leading signals and things to watch in terms of level of comfort. And the thing is that when we ask about the precautions that need to be in place, that culture goers articulate in order to kind of return to those in-person arts and cultural performances and exhibitions, vaccinations still remain at the top of the list. The good news is that Canada, especially compared to a number of other countries, is doing a very good job on vaccinations. Of course, it's not perfect, but the numbers have been good and have been trending in the right direction. And the other thing is that of note for indoor culture goers who've already returned or plan to return, vaccination is still kind of the top driver for them. And for indoor culture goers who are still waiting, so these are not the people that have returned or plan to return immediately, but for those who are waiting, vaccinations are still quite important. You can see about 6 out of every 10 individuals kind of citing vaccinations as that precondition to making them feel comfortable. On the indoor event dimension, so to speak, the interesting thing is that the mention of social distancing and masks is still quite significant and actually has been on the rise. I think it's one of those things where, and perhaps this is something to put on the table, in the research that we've done and that what we've seen in the public health area, we may see the use of masks, voluntary use of masks, even if it's not required by the public health authorities, may actually be a continuing kind of hallmark for some individuals, even after the pandemic. So I put that on the table, not as a potential obstacle, but as an observation that masks may be part of the culture of going out, at least for certain parts of the population who feel that they're at risk. Not only want to get the virus, but they also don't want to get the flu. And so we put that on the table as kind of part of the ongoing kind of environment that we'll probably be dealing with. But one of the numbers that really jumped had to do with, you can see the question at the bottom of the screen, are you concerned, somewhat not concerned, or not concerned about the survival of arts cultural organizations? A whopping 7 out of 10 culture goers, you can see, have some level of concern about the survival of the arts and cultural organizations that they love. And when we think about that intensity of concern, about 3 out of every 10 say that they're outright concerned, and about 4 out of every 10 say that they're somewhat concerned. But the fact of the matter is that the majority of Canadian culture goers are worried about how arts and cultural organizations in Canada will get through this pandemic and whether they will survive. It speaks to people returning to those in-person events and experiences that they love. And think of it this way, as they return, what's on their mind is, how are the arts and cultural organizations that I love, how are they making out? Will they survive the pandemic? How long can kind of what I'll say this current environment last? and what might it mean for the future of arts and cultural organizations. So I put this on the table. We have on the one hand, what I'll say, a greater level of appetite and reported participation in person, but also a significant level of anxiety when people worry about whether arts and cultural organizations, how they'll survive the pandemic. And, one of the questions that we revisited had to do with donations and philanthropy. And if you remember in the previous study that we did in one of the previous waves, we'd asked culture goers about their expected donation in 2020, and that came in at about $126 a year on average. And what we saw, at least when we repeated the same question and asked about their reported donation for 2020, it was actually only $114. So it's down a little bit. But quite interestingly, when we ask about donations for the 2021 year, if you remember in that one webinar that I was participating in, where we were talking about a certain level of generosity, I call it pent-up generosity that people expected once we thought we were going to be over the hump at the end of 2021, that there would be some pent-up philanthropy. Well, what's interesting is that pent-up philanthropy was pegged at $222 on average in terms of a donation. But what their intention right now, at least for 2021, is actually $147. What does that mean? That those positive intentions to open up their wallet and be a little more generous than they were at the beginning of the pandemic does not seem to be manifesting itself. It's actually that those well intentions are about 34% lower than what people projected back when we did this question back in 2020. What does this mean? And we know from the other research that we've done, there's still a significant level of anxiety related to the economy and returning to work, and what this all might mean in terms of the strength of the Canadian economy. And what we're seeing is a little bit of what I'll say prolonged frustration and worry about the state of finances. And as a result, people not being as, what I'll say, generous as they thought they might have been back in July 2020. So I'm gonna I'm not gonna read this, because the good news is, as Aubrey said, go to the Business in the Arts website, download the report and all the stats. Also, I will be on the call. I will remain on the webinar to answer questions. Please post them in the chat. But the key takeaways here are reported attendance, in-person attendance is on the upswing. Concern about the survival of arts and cultural organizations is also very significant among culture goers. We have to think about vaccinations and masks as kind of those key things that make people comfortable about returning to events, and that, what I'll say, expected donations and philanthropy being a little muted, so to speak, compared to where people wanted to be when we last asked this question back in July 2020. And with that, I'll throw it back to the webinar.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's always a pleasure to get your summary of that research. As he mentioned, if anyone has any technical questions about the data of the methodology, please put them in the Q&A box, and Nick will respond to it during our discussion that we're about to have. So now I'd like to introduce our three panelists who will give us their take on the research findings. Our response panel is truly across a coast-to-coast perspective. We have guests joining us from PEI, Toronto, and Vancouver today. So from the East Coast, we have Nadine Haddad, who is the Director of Philanthropy at the Confederation Center of the Arts. Nadine is an enthusiastic fundraiser with over a decade of experience in the not-for-profit arts sector. As an emerging arts leader, she has worked with the National Ballet of Canada, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, Opera Italia, the Regent Park School of Music, and the Toronto Arts Foundation. She relocated to PEI this past spring to lead fundraising efforts at the Confederation Center. We also have Anne Maggisano joining us in Toronto. She is Vice President at Burgundy Asset Management, and where she manages investment portfolios for high net worth individuals and families. She's also founded and co-leads the firm's Women of Burgundy initiative to inspire and motivate more women to make investing a priority. and as a member of the CFA Institute, the New York Society of Securities Analysts, and the Toronto CFA Society. She's presently the chair of the Toronto Public Library Foundation Board and serves on the board of directors of the Canadian Opera Company and Crow's Theatre. She's also a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and an alumna of the Royal Canadian Navy Leaders at Sea program. And on the West Coast, we have Melissa Tsang. As managing director and co-leader of Urban Inc., Melissa works to uplift Indigenous and diverse voices through storytelling and performance. Melissa brings 15 years of experience as a cultural leader and administrator, having worked with organizations from across the performing arts disciplines, including Vancouver Opera, Arts Club Theatre Company, Music on Main, and Ballet BC. Melissa is also a current participant in Business and Arts Executive Leadership Program. So welcome to Anne, Nadine, and Melissa. We're going to go right into the donation data. It has been well publicized that the arts and culture sector has been one of the hardest hit in the pandemic. And as a result, it seems there's a high awareness of the challenges among the public, with the Nanos research showing 7 in 10 respondents expressed that they were concerned or somewhat concerned about survival of arts organizations. And yet this is not translating into a substantial increase in donations to the arts. Anne, let's start with you as a donor and as an art supporter yourself. Why do you think there's a disconnect between the public's expressed concern and taking action to donate?
Well, thank you, Aubrey. And I just want to say it's wonderful to be here and to be in conversation with Nadine and Melissa and Nick as well. So thank you. It's a great question, and I can bring the perspective of the performing arts to the table here because I serve on the board of Crow's Theatre and the Canadian Opera Company. And I would just share that historically donations to these performing arts organizations has really been tied to activity. So donors really enjoy giving money to bring a production to life. And the longer we are dark on our stages and we don't have productions to bring it to life, the longer it could be before donors feel willing to bring donations to the table and to support these organizations. But I also want to bring the perspective of the investment industry to bear on this discussion as well. I am in the investment industry, and what we've seen over the last year and a half is we've seen a real increase in household savings with all the uncertainty that Nick was mentioning in the report. And, you know, sort of that uncertainty, the longer the pandemic here is here and is continuing, continues to be a reason for people to hold on to cash. And so what that means is probably we're seeing a mindset of fear and a mindset of scarcity that is prohibiting people from being generous and from contributing to the arts.
So as a follow-up for you, Nadine, as a fundraiser, what tools do you have to close that gap and to motivate donors to give now to the arts instead of holding on to that cash?
Well, I think the data that Nick has presented here is really interesting, and particularly to many fundraising professionals, because I think we're natural data-driven decision makers, and that's kind of what guides us to, change how we do things in innovative and creative ways. So here at the Confederation Center, if you need to know, it's a national cultural hub in Charlottetown, PEI. We have a world-class theater and a national art gallery. And we've realized that our average donation from our donors is not too far off from the 2020 data that Nick has presented. But we are seeing our average gift this year to be lower than expected, but we have a larger number of gifts than the previous years. So we're seeing that there are more people giving in smaller amounts. So there is something to take away from that in the situation that we are, sometimes it's not just all about the amount of the dollars, but how many people you're engaging and how many people are still investing in the wonderful mission of your organization. So we know that the donor behavior has changed drastically. And even though that this has changed, I don't think the role of the fundraiser should. So our work really is about building lasting and trusting relationships with our donors who share a passion for our organization. So again, this may not come as a surprise, but I really do believe we just need to hone in on the communication piece with your donors. Drive the mission, impact, and passion of the work that you do. communicate what you're doing to reinstill that trust in your donor, to give back to your charity. I think it's really important to also divert the idea that core funding should only come from ticketing and government alone. I think individual donors here have a responsibility to enrich our cultural lives through their philanthropic gifts. So I believe that pre-COVID, it's always been a little difficult to make a case for why the arts were an urgent need. And I believe that now is the time to position it as vital and urgent. And we all have relied on the arts to get us through 2020 and 2021. And I believe the best thing to do here is to instigate a new value proposition on the arts and culture sector immediately.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks, Nadine. It's really interesting that you're actually seeing more donors, those smaller amounts. I guess the key there is to retain those new donors as we reopen and move over the seasons. We want to retain them. So that's key message there about communications and the messaging around impacts. And that's a really good segue over to Melissa. Urban Inc. hasn't taken the traditional path with donor campaigns. Can you tell us a little bit about your community-centric fundraising principles and the impact that it has had at Urban Inc.?
Hi, Aubrey. Thank you for having me today. Urban Inc.'s mission is to uplift Indigenous and diverse voices through storytelling and performance. And we are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and we're grateful to be here today. Otherwise known as Vancouver. We're a small company with a small level of individual giving, but with lots of potential to build and grow. I started with the company about a year and a half ago at the start of the pandemic. And during this pause, we've been reflecting on how we can decolonize and indigenize our administrative and operational practices, recognizing that many of our traditional methods for business growth are colonial. And so while we were evaluating how to build a giving program, we realized that the traditional giving programs and processes are ones that are transactional and often hierarchical, where a donor gives more and gets more. That doesn't really align with our vision for equity, where everyone in our circle is equally valued. So instead of fleshing out a benefits matrix where X tier gets this and Y tier gets that, sort of tying into what Nadine was saying about communications and value proposition, we've been working on aligning our communications, rooting in racial equity and social change. And in the past, we've seen giving in response to emotional connection to the work that we've produced in response to productions, as Anne had also mentioned. But despite having our productions postponed this past year, our tiny amount of individual giving has ever so slightly been growing. And I don't have the data to say why this is. Maybe it could be related to what Nick reported about concern for organizational survival. But maybe we're hoping folks might be more making more socially conscious donations decisions. But tying back to a few other community-centric fundraising type principles, being supportive of other organizations, where the community is greater than our mission. In our communications, we do encourage and share about work of and events of other organizations. And lastly, sometimes it does mean we have to have difficult conversations. And in one case, there was a small potential partnership that was just way too transactional. Where there was an itemized value for everything that we had to provide, including providing a photo of Indigenous and BIPOC folks. And we had to explain how items like this are not okay. And internally, we really had to evaluate putting in the effort to build a relationship with a company in need of systemic change, or just letting it go and walking away.
Before I move on, just if Nadine or Anne, if you have anything you want to respond to.
I was just going to note that when we looked at increasing of donations, with the number being larger last year, I think that was partly because of tickets that were, I think that has a role to play too, as a lot of tickets were refunded back into as donations. And so we're not seeing that trend this year so much. So just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, that is an important blip that happened in 2020 that we won't necessarily see again. So as Nick pointed out, we've seen the average amount that the public intends to give this year drop 34%, which is a pretty significant amount, but it still puts us sort of on par with what they did donate last year. And this is after a prolonged period in which many arts organizations had less visibility since they were closed and not performing, and often operating at much reduced capacities. But also, many of them were not hosting galas and fundraising events, which is a major way that people typically give to the arts. So, Nadine, I wonder what needs to change in the traditional approach to fundraising to appeal to donors now? And are galas and fundraising events perhaps a thing of the past?
Yeah, so, there's this new normal that we're living in with very few certainties and many questions. So, and this might be the first of many pandemics. So our approach to fundraising is going to consistently change, I believe, over the next 5-10 years. And just like Anne mentioned, we're not seeing our donations come from, as much as previous years simply because there is no experience or performance attached to that. So that path is kind of disrupted and we kind of have to reformulate it into a new system. But for us here at the center, we know that we want to emphasize our focus on our current and lapsed donors as well, because we know that many people are not shifting their giving to different organizations at this time. They're kind of staying the course and continuing to support the nonprofits that they've loved pre-pandemic. So that's how kind of where we're putting our emphasis on and engagement with our patrons. But I also want to touch a little bit about donor advised funds. And, I do believe that philanthropy needs to be open and unrestricted as possible. And we need the money to keep the lights on, to keep our staff and our artists hired throughout all of this. And restricted gifts really handcuff the organization and there provides no room for flexibility or responsive action to the greatest needs of the organization in times of emergencies like the ones that we are living in right now. And I also want to touch a little bit about the fundraising gala approach. So, I think there's been a decrease in the appetite for these gala formats long before the pandemic. 60% of gala budget goes towards the venue, equipment, rentals, catering, etc. And believe it or not, 40% of Canadian charities rely on events for revenue. So this is quite a large number. And if anything, the pandemic has killed the traditional gala format that many arts organizations have relied on and have forced organizations to become creative and execute their new and innovative gala format online, which, has been very successful for many because we are creative people who work in creative organizations. I believe we are warriors in all of this and are able to make the best out of everything that we've been given. So, there are some barriers to the online gala format with many people finding it now difficult to navigate the digital world. But on the plus side, it keeps you connected to your patrons. And galas are really, really wonderful opportunities to continue and steward the relationship you have with your donors and other supporters. So there's also a benefit to having people all across Canada or across the globe partake in your mission online if they were to attend one of your fundraisers digitally. So, I think there's an opportunity also to rethink the traditional format simply because from what I've seen from Nick's data is that we see a high percentage of people wanting to attend outdoor events. So if your gala is traditionally indoors, why not move it to be outdoors? Cycling, golf tournaments, community barbecues, fundraising runs. I think people have spent so much time at home and are looking for ways to be active in their community and give back at this time.
If I can, I just want to reinforce Nadine's comment on the value of undesignated funds. That was one of the main learnings that I picked up over the last year. If you don't have a reasonable level of undesignated giving, then you can't sustain yourself as an organization in moments of crises. And it's in moments of crises where we learn what it takes to build the resilient organization long term. And having a really healthy balance between undesignated and designated funds is really important. going forward, and should be top of mind for all arts organizations as they think about building resilience for the future.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really key point. And that actually takes us really well to my next question is about resilience. For Melissa, we are seeing these levels of intended donations drop, but at the same time, the universal emergency government support measures that we almost all of us have relied on the past year and a half, such as wage subsidy and rent subsidy, are now done. There's been announcements about some new targeted programs, but we don't know all the details yet about eligibility. And so we're really in a transition period. And as we move through this transition period, what are you thinking about? What things are you going to focus on to try and stay financially resilient?
Yes, firstly, for the funders on the line, we are so grateful for all of the government and private pandemic support. Thank you. It's been so key and needed for us to engage Indigenous and diverse artists in our circle and to continue to share their stories through this pandemic. And we're grateful for the support to retain staff. At Urban Inc., for us to be financially resilient, we've had to be operationally flexible. Pre-pandemic, many people here from arts organizations will know we have to plan 3 years in advance and submit to funders. And then in this last year, we've had to put that all aside and think about what can we do now. In this past year, Urban Inc., instead of being on a national tour, we've made a feature-length documentary and just shot a musical feature film, which has been a fantastic opportunity for us to enter a new market while engaging diverse local artists who are out of work. Shameless plug, Stories That Transform Us, our documentaries at VIF and available to stream in BC online. Check it out. And the musical that we just shot is Les Filles du Roi by Corey Payette and Julie McIsaac, a trilingual musical in English, French, and Mohawk. Okay, shameless plug over. We've also had opportunities come quite quickly, and all of this was possible because much of the COVID relief funding was unrestricted and flexible, just echoing a lot of what Nadine and Anne had to say. I hope what funders and donors might take away from this is that during this transition and post-pandemic, the ability for us to be financially resilient is to be organizationally flexible. And this means, yes, some of us might need to postpone our projects longer than the typical 3-year grant or funding project timeline, or you might need to defer some of our funds to another fiscal year. There are so many uncertainties right now and audience hesitancy, as we see in some of the data about returning. And so that's, I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Yes, flexibility, I think, is the big keyword that we all need to keep in mind. Now, as Nick showed, there are a lot of Canadians concerned about the survival of Canadian arts organizations. I think it's safe to say we shouldn't be too worried that the Toronto Public Library will not survive the pandemic as a major institution in Toronto that you're on the board of. And so, however, I think Torontonians did come to really appreciate during the time that the library branches were closed was how much they act as social hubs in our neighborhoods, providing key services and learning opportunities for so many different segments of society, as well as, of course, an access point to great literature from around the world. What lessons does the Toronto Public Library Foundation take from this time, and how might it transform the way the foundation is fundraising for its programs, services, and spaces going forward?
Yeah, thank you. One of the positive outcomes of the pandemic, if there can be a positive outcome, is that people in Toronto have come to appreciate the full value that the library brings to our community even more. Whereas in the past, one might associate the library simply with books and with reading. The urgent pivots that Vickery Bowles, our city librarian, made during the pandemic to really serve the communities that need it the most what came to the fore of every Torontonian's mind. Some examples of things she did were pivoting some of the library branches to serve as food banks. She understood that librarians are used to working on the front lines in the community, and that they could, instead of handing out books, they could hand out food. And then another key initiative that she did sort of from the very beginning was she appreciated that not everybody had the same digital experience during the pandemic, and that there are many families in our city that actually don't have computers at home. And so pivoting to really give digital connectivity kits, so handing out laptops and internet connectivity kits to families who needed it the most. So that urgency with which Vickery was able to meet the community where it needed it the most has really sort of galvanized the donors of the foundation to be part of the solution. And as we look forward to the future and we start to come to understand that we have some really big challenges that we need to solve, challenges around inequality that are only going to get worse the longer that the pandemic is here. We have a community of donors that really want to be part of the solution and want to step forward and shape a better city for all of us going forward. And so I really think it was that urgency of pivoting and really sort of serving the community where it needed the most that was the galvanizing force there.
So many arts venues also acted as community hubs. Some even stepped in during the pandemic as sites for vaccination clinics or other important services. Is there an opportunity for arts facilities to think differently about their place in our community moving forward? Specifically, Nadine, you're at a multidisciplinary arts center. And how do you think this could help to make arts centers more flexible and more resilient?
Yeah, so it's actually, I'm kind of running off of what Anne was mentioning about libraries, but most people probably don't know this, but the library, the public library here rents space from the Confederation Center of the Arts. And they're actually moving across the street in the new year. So we have an entire building that's going to be vacant. So we are rethinking our space and trying to see if we can shift our mindset from doing things for our community to doing things with our community. So that space is currently, up for innovative exploration. But right now, we definitely want to keep our community at the forefront of all of this. But when the spaces in our building are not used for artistic programming, they are used for event rental and catering. And our theater sits dark for many months of the year. And we have begun to think about the opportunity to work with local community organizations and provide more work for arts industry people. For example, we have a 20,000 square foot workshop for carpentry and painting sets that's only used 4 to 5 months leading up to our festival. So we're currently exploring ways that we could use it in the off season to train some creative industry set builders and painters, or even for the building of sporting event equipment. So this would also provide a lot of work for our crew in the off season. And our spaces too here at the center are expensive and create a lot of barriers for community organizations to access. But with the support of a wonderful donor this year, we've been able to actually create a partnership program where we can offer subsidized rental agreements for local community organizations to access our space. So really excited about that partnership and inviting more of our community into our large building downtown Charlottetown. But I definitely think this kind of like extends from the question before about the fundraising approach today. And I definitely think it just hones back to how arts organizations definitely need to diversify their revenue portfolio. And space is definitely an important one.
So Melissa, Urban Inc. doesn't have a space of its own, doesn't have a facility or venue, but instead you partnered with the Culch and with Vancouver International Film Festival to present your fall hybrid season. How are partnerships and collaborations going to be really important as strategies for arts companies to reopen and to recover?
Yeah, for Urban Inc. partnerships have been the only way we've been able to produce our work to share Indigenous and diverse stories on a large scale across the country. There's just no way we'd be able to financially produce on our own, and partnerships make it financially possible. Partnerships are a way for us to support each other as arts organization and to expand our reach. We're so grateful to Heather Redfern and the Culch, which is a venued organization, for being open and supportive and flexible and always saying, how can we help? Oh, we need to change. What can we do? How about this? And earlier I mentioned operational flexibility. Sometimes these opportunities can only happen during fast timelines. I met Kyle Fostner, the ED of VIF, at a group Zoom call in July. We chatted and we just premiered our documentary stories that transform us at the beginning of October. And with an interest in decolonization and transitioning to post-pandemic, we're kind of bothered by the phrase return to normal because the normal from equity perspective didn't work. Partnerships require us to administratively and operationally reevaluate how we work because we have to meld together processes between two organizations or maybe more organizations and explain them to each other and decide how we're going to do things. And so the great thing is that there are more minds to think about and work towards change, and partnerships are opportunities for us to learn together and from each other.
Yeah, so that was how you reopened in a way this fall through your hybrid season. So, but we did see a lot of festivals and events over the summer, especially outdoors, that were testing the water on reopening. And that Nick showed that there was a big jump, 36% for people who returned to outdoor, and similar for art galleries and museums. And of course, the fact that more than 76% of Canadians are now fully vaccinated is probably playing a big role in that return. But some organizations, like yourself at Confederation Center, had performances on stage this summer. But then PEI introduced on October 5th a proof of vaccination requirement for arts, theater, and music events. How does that actually, the implementation of the vaccine passport, change the scenario? Does it make it easier to welcome patrons back, or is it actually presenting some new challenges?
So it definitely makes it easier, which is good. So I think it would be helpful for everyone to know that PEI has a small population of 156,000 people. And of that number, over 136,000 people are double vaccinated. So that's 87% of our entire population, which is really good numbers. But so this vaccination pass really stands for our theater. Our art gallery is exempt from the vaccination requirements, but I'll talk a little bit about how our theater has proceeded with these new regulations. So we've had 4 events in the theater since October 5th with double vaccination requirements for all audience, participants, and staff and artists. And we have opened to nearly full capacity. We went from 300 socially distanced in the summer to close to 1,100 non-socially distanced in our theater. Our mask mandates are still in place unless food or beverage is consumed. And while the theater isn't completely full, I think it's safe to say that the numbers are relatively reasonable given the rapid changes and the comfort level of audience members returning to the theater. So we have surpassed our 300 mark that we had in the summer that we were restricted to, which is a good sign. And it's a clear sign that we're seeing more people back. And I think this has to do with our new policy. People are feeling more comfortable and safe to be in the theater. However, there are still a few members that are reluctant. There are patrons that still wish to be distanced, in which we've been able to accommodate in our theater. But most are happy to be back. They're confident that the vaccine is providing enough protection so that the exposure to the virus is not as threatening. We also suspect that not everybody has fully returned simply because a lot of parents with children 12 and under who are not vaccinated are avoiding the theater right now for safety reasons, which are all reasonable concerns. So we're seeing a lot of people generally very happy, and people are following the protocols. We've had little to no issues with that, which has been really great. Of course, the introduction of the Vax Pass has increased our financial expenses. I'm sure most arts organizations can see that there's more staff required. We have security at all entry points of our theater. We have new digital scanners that are expensive. We have increased our inventory of cleaning and sanitization products. So all of those, also provide an opportunity to maybe capitalize on a sponsorship opportunity with a cleaning product company, which I've already seen happen. So lots of creative ways there to garner some financial support. But overall, it's looking promising, and we're hoping for like an economically vibrant future for the arts to come here in Charlottetown. So, yes.
And you're on the board of the Canadian Opera Company, which announced its return to stage on October 15th. The return will be in February, but it made the announcement in October. And it has been selling subscriptions for that season. So this came after the Ontario government had already implemented our provincial vaccine passport. Was that a deciding factor in the COC's timeline, or were there other major reasons that the COC is waiting until February?
Yes, the major reason has to do with the complexity of opera as an art form. If you think of the scale and the scope of opera and sort of the number of people required to be on stage and in the orchestra pit, it requires a really long planning cycle and programming cycle and contracting cycle with the artists. If we had planned to launch in September and have our season opener in September, we would have had to start to make those commitments back in early January, February. And if you could think back to that time, there was still a lot of uncertainty in the world around COVID trajectories, around vaccine distribution in Canada. It was really a difficult time to be making decisions around what the fall would look like. And any decision to do that would have put undue financial risk on the organization. So that's one of the reasons, and you also think about logistical, operational details in terms of putting an opera to life. The opera singers that we use and the artists come from all over the world and across Canada. And that requires really complex travel, logistics, and with all the quarantine restrictions and the travel restrictions, it would have been logistically and operationally very, very challenging to bring people from around the world together to be able to perform on our stage. And the third major contributing factor would have to do with the fact that we share the Four Seasons Performing Center for the Arts with the National Ballet. So we have the house in September and October, and the ballet has the house in November and December. So for all those reasons, and I'm sure a lot more, we made the decision to have our season opening and our launch in February. And one of the things that the COC did quite smartly because of this delayed launch was that they really prioritized communicating with their donors and their audience very regularly. They came out with a weekly newsletter in which they help people understand what was going on in the COC, how they were pivoting to the digital realm, what they could expect for the future of this art form and the vision of the company. And in that newsletter, they really prioritized telling stories from artists and really prioritized bringing the creators' voices to life. And that was a deliberate way in which they were able to connect on an emotional level with their patrons and their donors, and really help ensure that the donor community understood that they had a responsibility to nurture and support this creative hub of artists that surrounds the COC. And as a result of that, what the COC is seeing is they are seeing a shift away from people wanting to donate simply to put on productions or simply for the purpose of receiving benefits like behind the scenes experiences or these kinds of things. What they're seeing and what they've seen over the last year is that they're seeing their donor community really want to give purely to ensure that this organization survives. And so it's a shift in mindset in terms of how donors think about their responsibility for stewarding an organization and for stewarding an art form into the future. And so there's been an expanded understanding of what philanthropy purpose is and what the role of the donor is, and how the COC and opera as an art form can really be a contributor to the civic life of our city and our communities.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like the COC communications department has been doing a really fantastic job. That's tough, but also really important. And especially, I think, for people who are on the outside, they don't know all the things that go into producing a show and don't know all those logistical challenges. To convey that and to help the donors and audiences understand why you're not going back to the stage until February really makes a difference. Because we have been in a situation where restrictions and rules have changed very last minute, very suddenly, and then companies have had to adapt. So the introduction of vaccine passports in many provinces have ushered in the relaxation of capacity restrictions very suddenly over the past couple of weeks. As of October 8th, facilities in Quebec and Ontario could open to full capacity. And likewise, a couple days ago in BC, that has gone to full capacity with the exception of the northern areas under stricter rules right now. Yet an article in Le Devoir last week indicated that audiences in Quebec are not flooding back and that ticket sales are very last minute, with purchases coming in within 24 hours of performances, which kind of mirrors the hesitancy we saw in the Nanos research and also a lot of the anecdotal stories that we're hearing from performing arts organizations across the country. But Anne, you're also on the board of Crow's Theatre. And Crow's has a fall season on right now. So I'm wondering if you can comment about what Crow's approach for reopening to 100% capacity has been and how you as a board member have helped them think through mitigating risk.
Yes, Crow's Theatre is the first not-for-profit theatre in Toronto to bring theatre to our stages. And it's been pretty exciting to see them launch and to be a participant in the theater. And I've been 4 times, so I encourage everybody to go to their local theaters as they're opening. In the case of Crow's Theatre, back in the early winter, sort of spring, they went through what they self-describe as a bit of an existential crisis. People were asking them, and these are donors and they are also artists, asking them if they were going to come back as a theater and what the future of Crow's really looked like. And was it just going to be digital or were they going to bring back live performances on stage? And because of that questioning, the management made a decision that their priority coming into this fall was really going to put money into the hands of artists, that they were going to commit to bringing live theater back and they were going to commit to putting money into the hands of artists, even if it meant that they were going to have to pivot to the digital space at the last minute. And so, yes, of course, what that meant is that they really had to manage a lot of risks. They had to manage the safety and health risks of their performers and the audience. And they've done that very well by adhering to all the safety precautions like masking and everything else that everybody is fully aware of. They had to manage the financial risk of putting on a season when there was so much uncertainty with the pandemic. And the way that they did that was they were very, very strict on expenses in the early part of this year. And they really cut back because they wanted to make sure they had a bit of a buffer as they came into the season. And in the event that audiences didn't come back, they were able to sustain live theater. And they've also been very smart with their programming. So they've deliberately decided to program shows that could be easily pivoted to the digital sphere at the last minute if it had to. And also they were very mindful around cast sizing and these sorts of things. So they managed that risk very well. And then I would say the fourth risk that they've managed really well has to do with audience risk. We're in an environment right now where we all have access to great content online, and it's really, really hard to bring people out of their homes. And one of the things that Crow's has done really well is that they've created a full experience. So when you go to the theater, you don't just see a live theater show, but they have a bar, they have a restaurant affiliated with the theater. There's live music in the lobby after the show ends, so you can hang out and you can have a drink with your friends. So you can have a full night out experience at Crow's Theatre. And it's just a way to really add more value to people and to help them feel more comfortable coming out of their homes.
Sounds wonderful. So I see we have a lot of questions waiting for us, but I just wanted to give Melissa and Nadine a moment if you had anything further that you wanted to comment before we go to the question. No, we're good. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Erin, who will take us into the live Q&A.
Thanks, Aubrey. Before getting started, I just would like to mention that we are now accepting nominations for the 2022 Business and Arts Awards. So has your arts organization partnered with a company to deliver a really innovative program? Or do you perhaps know a young professional who has demonstrated exemplary volunteer leadership in the arts? If so, I would strongly suggest you consider nominating them or yourself for one of the Business and Arts Awards. Join the likes of RBC, Green Thumb Theatre, Netflix, Vibe Arts, Artscape, and many more, whose exceptional dedication to the arts sector has been recognized through our annual award celebration. So these nominations are open until December 10th, 2021, and you can visit businessandarts.org/nominate to learn more about the awards program, eligibility criteria, and how to nominate yourself or another champion of the arts. Okay, now on to the question and answers. So I do have a question here from a participant who's noting that a trend that they're noting is that online cultural offerings are being monetized through either a direct ticket purchase or a donation. And this donation would also suggest that the purchaser would benefit from a tax receipt. So this participant is wondering if this practice is raising any red flags, either with something like the CRA or organization's board of directors. Anyone want to jump in on this one?
I'm going to defer to Nadine and Melissa front line. So
I was going to defer to you as the finance person.
Okay. I think sort of this is an area that's still up for exploration in terms of what is the purpose of digital art in this new world, and is it meant just as a way to increase audience awareness of the organizations and ultimately to convert them into ticket buyers, sort of to help them and help inspire them to actually come into the theater? Is there actually going to be a way to monetize digital art and make it viable, or is it just going to be a cost where all of a sudden arts organizations, where they used to just have to put on live plays or live opera, now with the same sort of constraints on resources, have to also put on live theater and also put on digital experiences as well. So this is an area that's evolving pretty quickly. When you think of long term, ultimately it's going to be a balance between what is it that people want to see, and where is the value that the arts organizations bring? What is the value that they bring to people's lives? And getting very, very clear on that, and then also sort of being mindful that if the value is to produce art that is live and in community, then what is the purpose of the digital, and how can we be smart with our resources and ensure that they're being allocated wisely, and sort of that there's no dilution in terms of people's time and energy and focus.
I was going to add, sort of logistically, it sort of depends on how the organization has sort of gone about this. In our case, our digital offerings were tied to tickets, but I know that some other organizations, it depends. I don't know if it's been a straight transaction. Some ticketing systems allow for donations, in their system, so it's pretty straightforward. Some folks have just put in like a little pop-up screen at the end of their video and saying link to donate, and it's just your standard donation process. So it's kind of hard to answer that question, I suppose, but without going to the logistics.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do here is to just review your CRA donation regulations. I know there's clearly an advantage here by watching a performance, so you might want to check in to see what rules are in place there. But I just refreshed my own CRA ticketing and donation knowledge not long ago, but I'm pretty sure that it might be a little problematic. If I would kind of go towards the straight ticket or pay what you can option and leave the donation kind of separate.
Also say that when in doubt, ask your own auditor. That they should be the person that you ultimately go to for this kind of advice.
Great, thank you. So our next question. So one of our participants would like to note that the CCF is awesome and that they're a huge proponent of the value system behind these steps towards economic justice. And so they were wondering if there is any movement from charities legislation or a desire from the fundraising community that would allow movement forward towards acknowledging services in kind in a charitable way. So I think this person is a little bit of an addendum here, saying, especially when folks who may typically be doing unpaid labor are doing it for space/other benefits. in kind more likely falls to an economic tier that is more vulnerable than someone who can just drop cash in exchange for potentially the same benefits. Did that question make sense there? So I guess kind of what's the line between this work being charitable volunteerism versus unpaid labor?
I don't know if I can speak to this scenario. And I don't do any sort of advocating on that sort of level of legal change. I think that for us, like in some of our partnerships, we're not super concerned about that. We're just, if we're partnering with another organization, we're just doing that. We're not really tracking all those hours, even though sometimes our funders or whatever require us to. But I don't think I can really speak to this question particularly.
Okay, great, no problem. We'll move on to the next question here. And a participant is wondering if anyone is aware of what limitations or regulations there are related to nonprofit organizations investing a portion of their reserves into a cloud-based investment program. Is anyone familiar with that? No, no problem. We'll move on to the next question. Someone here was wondering why, if there was a reason why there weren't any outdoor performances presented during the warm summer months by the COC. And could you speak a little bit to that perhaps?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think it had to do with sort of all of the changing regulations and restrictions that were happening at, at the time. We also have a new general director who just started, I believe, in March. He came in and sort of has really taken his time to get to know the organization, understand the COC, understand what makes it tick and what makes it great, and has spent his time really sort of planning for the future. And so I think that had a big part to do with it, and sort of we are looking forward to seeing his vision and hearing what he has to say about the future of the COC. And how he's going to build on Alexander Neef's tenure and really take the COC into the future. So I think that would be probably one of the main reasons why there weren't any performances in the summer, and why the focus has really been on the future.
Great, thanks so much. So I think these are all of the questions that we have here. Thank you again. And so this concludes our question and answer period for today. So I'd now like to pass things over to the Chair of Business and Arts, Robert Foster.
Thank you. We are back. We are back. We are finally going out. In the last 2 weeks, Julia and I have been to 3 commercial gallery openings with the artists. We've been to 3 not-for-profit events. It's very exciting. So the news, I think, is positive, and we're moving in the right direction. I'd like to, first of all, give a big thank you to Nick Nanos of Nanos Research for his continued partnership on the Arts Response Tracking Survey. Nick, it's extremely helpful to us and gives us guidance in terms of strategy and management of our assets. In terms of our 3 participants today, Nadine, you may recall that in 2017, we had our art summit at your location, the Confederation. And interestingly enough, our keynote political speaker then was Melanie Joly, who is our new Foreign Affairs Minister. So hopefully she'll be supportive of cultural diplomacy, something many of us believe in strongly, and we may have a new voice to help us in that. So it's exciting to see you, and the Confederation is doing well, and we wish you the very best. We had a wonderful time there those few years ago. And I've known you now for some time, and you've been kind enough to be supportive in every way, including coming to our art summits and speaking as a guest at those. And of course, your organization is exceptionally well known for your generosity both financially and leadership. A number of your partners have chaired various arts organizations, including Stratford. And so thank you once again for giving us your voice. Melissa, I don't know you, but I'm from Vancouver. That's my hometown. So it has to be good. So it's nice to meet you, and thank you for your contribution as well. The three of you have made it interesting and stimulating and contributed, I think, to the conversation. You know, when Nick said that 7 out of 10 are concerned about our survival, that gives us a great leading edge when we go in and plead for financial support from people. After all, we as arts and culture only get about 3 or 4% of the total philanthropic pie. So we really are a small percentage of the total. It's important that we get that, and of course continue the battle to try and improve that number. But I always say to people, if you'll support arts and culture, you're supporting a lifestyle for yourself. I mean, what could be more fun than giving some money and having wonderful seats and enjoying a great show, seeing wonderful art? So to me, you give to university and hospitals, if you give them enough, they'll put your name up somewhere and you're gone. Whereas if you support the things that we all do, you get entertained, you meet wonderful people, and you have something to discuss as you go forward. So I'm a great fan of the positive arguments when we go and ask for money. Let me also just say that the only way to get money out of people is to ask them. You've got to confront them. You've got to look them in the eye and say, I need your help. And that's the way it works. And I urge all of you to make sure that your boards and your team that report to you really do that. They get out and they, of course, give themselves and get people to match and exceed whatever it is they're doing. I guess I'd like to also recognize that this whole adventure started with Chris Deacon and the National Arts Center, who thought that we should be tracking this. And then this turned into a joint venture with him. I've known Chris Deacon a long time. He's a wonderful individual doing a terrific job at the NAC. And it's wonderful to have partners like that for business and arts. In addition, of course, we've received support from David Bennett, and David's on our board. He's a wonderful corporate leader, a great lover of the arts. And as many of you may know, his son is a very well-known choreographer. Irfan Raji recently joined our board, and Christine Armstrong, his wife, once worked at Business and Arts. So this is all sort of family coming together, and it's a very wonderful feeling, I have to tell you. Finally, I'd just like to mention that we have a new minister as of a few hours ago, and that's Minister Pablo Rodriguez, who was our minister some 2 ago, I guess, and then was House Leader. He's been brought back, and I think it's important to note that this government has 8 pieces of priority legislation that they intend to pass in the next 100 days. And 3 of the 8 are going to be led by the Heritage Minister. So this is a very important responsibility, which explains why the Prime Minister wanted someone who has real skills in the House. And as a House Leader, of course, those would have been honed. The 3 pieces of legislation are the Broadcasting Act, the Online Hate Legislation Act, and support for media outlooks. And that one deals with the issue of online services disseminating news for which they do not pay. And that is going to be addressed. So we have a minister, a new minister, with some very serious responsibilities. I've already begun the process of reaching out to him. And we've always had a good relationship with the Heritage Ministers. As I said, we had Melanie Jolie, and now she's foreign affairs. So it's, we're doing well. Let me conclude by saying that please visit Business/Arts website, follow us on social media, and we hope we see everybody again soon. The attendance that we get at these webinars has just been wonderful. We hope they've proven stimulating and worthwhile for everybody. Let me conclude by saying, please get your mask on and get out. See you all later. Bye.